Hello and welcome to the afternoon session, which is about the challenges facing democracy. Now, I expect most of us around the hall here like the idea of democracy, but it can, of course, be very exhausting, very enervating at times with its short-termism, its rising levels of mendacious bullshit every time there's an election coming around. And then, of course, there's the tyranny of referendums, which some of us have had to suffer more than others. And more recently, along with the polarization of social and political discourse in many, many parts of the world, there is, for the first time, something which, certainly when I was growing up, we never really imagined, and that is serious and possibly existential threats to democracy in many parts of the world. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this session, and I would like to start with Katarzyna Pełczyńska-Nałęcz because there are two probably outstanding elections this year in Europe, which mean a lot to us. One we've just had the first round of on Sunday, that's Turkey, of course, and I'll invite Soli a little later on to give us an assessment of that. But the other one coming in the autumn, and this is not to diminish the importance of the Slovak elections or the forthcoming parliamentary elections in Montenegro or the elections in Greece or anywhere else that I happen to have forgotten in Europe. The other one which we're really watching with bated breath is in Poland. So Katarzyna, we're desperate to learn from you whether we're coming to the end of the populist peace government, and if we are, what does that mean? And if we're not, what does that mean? So please take the podium, and we look forward to it.
Actually, I believed that I was asked to talk about the challenges to democracy, not only in Poland, but I'll try to answer your question at the end of my presentation if you give me just 1 extra minute for that. But as everyone here, I wanted to start with the quotation, a very simple one, which comes from our program, and it's democracies in siege, authoritarian regimes and tendencies are on the rise. And why this sentence is important? Because while discussing the challenges to democracy, we very often forget that autocracies, especially autocracies in Europe, are also not doing well. And in fact, the war in Ukraine is the effect of a profound crisis of the biggest European autocracy. The autocracy, which cannot, because of the domestic problems, cannot exist any longer without military conflict, and cannot conduct this war, that's the good news for us, in an effective way. So the war only exacerbates the crisis of the autocratic/totalitarian Russia. And it's not only Russia which is in crisis. Just to illustrate the inflation rate in Europe in March 2023, it's 50.6% Turkey, 25.6% Hungary, while average EU it's 8.4, in the euro area 6.9. So it is important that we remember that it's not only the crisis of democracy, it's also, at least in Europe, the crisis of autocracy. And here, of course, the question arises whether what is more dangerous for our, the prospering or failing autocracy. Having said this, I would like very briefly to highlight 5 challenges to democracy which were caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Firstly, this is the very much feared refugee crisis. And we've been dealing with totally unprecedented situation in Europe. We have 5 million refugees registered under temporary protection or national protection schemes. Only in my country, in Poland, 1.5 million refugees with 11 million border crossing registers since the beginning of the war. Just to compare, in 2015, and that was perceived as a major crisis, refugee crisis in Europe, around 1 million refugees have arrived to the European coast. So, given the scale of this crisis, the effect, I would say, was quite moderate. In fact, Poland peacefully turned into a multinational state without any serious security incidents so far. Obviously, that does not mean that there is no negative sentiment against Ukrainians growing, especially in Central European countries. It has happened also in Poland, but what is interesting, and quite surprising, this negative sentiment is mainly among young women, not young men. Why? Because they compete with Ukrainian mothers and children for the public services, nurseries, healthcare, education. But this does not fuel, because they are young women, this does not fuel the support for the populist and far-right parties in Poland. The second challenge, it's economic warfare. That's obvious that every democracy develops better, and that the economic prosperity is very important stabilizing factor for a democracy. And the European Union, in fact, has entered the full-scale, full-scale economic war. We've implemented 11 packages of sanction. We've undergone rapid energy transformation, cutting off, actually, almost totally the energy dependence of Russia. That's been the revolutionary change. And the political effect is, I would say, quite moderate. It's very difficult to assess, but it seems that there is, I would argue that there is only one country where this economic earthquake has changed the political landscape, and this is Slovakia, with growing support for the Social Democratic Party of far-right populist Fico. Third challenge is the undermining our rule of law by ourselves. There have been many comments that we need more decisiveness in Europe, that Europe has to decide quicker, and as the title of our summit even says, it's time to decide. But to decide in democracy means to engage in a certain process, and it takes time. So when you fight autocratic country like Russia, the temptation appears that in order to be more effective, quicker, just why not to bypass or a little bit adjust to our need existing regulations and existing law? And this is the tremendous challenge which hasn't been actually discussed much for the rule of law and democracy in Europe. And sometimes this violation of law is done with the good intentions, but sometimes it happens because someone wants to use the security challenges in order to strengthen his power. And the war is used as a pretext for extraordinary security measures. The good news is that such problems as illicit surveillance and spyware, I mean, the biggest scandal in this sphere happened before the war. And perhaps we are a little bit more immune now. It happened in Hungary, Poland, also mainly in these two countries, but also Portugal, Spain. And nothing like this, surprisingly, didn't happen during the war, but of course it does not mean that it may not happen in the months to come. The fourth challenge, that's the challenge of which I will call the revival of the national state. It didn't start yesterday, but it is, absolutely obvious fact that sovereignty has become an important element of public debate, and there is growing appetite for sovereignty in the European among the Europeans and across Europe. And here I would say it's very important not to perceive this appetite, this demand for sovereignty as the challenge for democracy. We cannot dismiss it. We should not say that in order to prevent the revival of nationalism, we should take this demand for sovereignty and for the growing role of the national state very seriously and think how to reconcile the sovereign state with the European integration and with the enlargement. And last but not least, this is the narrative challenge. The war, as we all know, it's not only about military conflict, this is the economic warfare, this is the social warfare, and of course this is the war of narrative. And here, Russia is very active, still is very active with disinformation campaign, with propaganda, interference in our domestic processes. And definitely we should all be very much aware of this. But there are very interesting results of the recent ECFR studies, which shows that actually over the last year, the pro-European sentiment in Europe has strengthened, while the pro-Russian has weakened significantly. So this is obviously it differs from country to country, but still it's one more good news. So what I wanted to tell you here is that yes, the Russian invasion of Ukraine poses very serious threats to our democracies. And we should not underestimate it. We should be absolutely aware of them. But at the same time, I think we can say that the first battle was won, and that our democracies have done pretty well during this year. There will be, the game is not over. There will be still, I'm afraid, many years of, if not open military conflict, then at least very serious tensions between Russia and Europe. But it seems that this war is more damaging to autocracies in Europe so far than to democracies.
Katarzyna, thank you very much.
And I remember your question about Poland.
I'm going to come back to you on the Polish issue, but that's a great place to stop because what your remarks did was, I think, set up Jan-Werner Müller quite nicely, as Jan is going to talk to us about fragmentation in Europe and who is responsible for populism, authoritarianism, or whatever it is we decide to call it. Jan.
Thank you. So when one thinks about internal threats to democracy in Europe today, I think one image is still most likely to come to mind. And that is the image of the supposedly unstoppable wave of populism. And what I want to suggest to you is that this image is empirically misleading, and it's also politically pernicious. And instead, I would like to reframe our debate along two lines. One has indeed to do with fragmentation of party systems, and the other one has to do with what bluntly can be called the mainstreaming or the normalization of the far right. So fragmentation first. I think across Europe we've seen what you may also call the Netherlandization of party systems, almost up to 20 parties in a parliament. Obviously, this has made coalition formation and governing more difficult in certain ways. Also raises questions from a democratic theory point of view about accountability. Nevertheless, I would not agree with our great colleague Adam Przeworski, still probably the leading political scientist in the world, that instability or changeover in party systems is automatically a sign of crisis for democracy. And all those who maybe pine for a golden age of large people's parties or of an era when society as a whole, the chorus of society, sang in a more harmonious way, I think we have to remind ourselves that, well, it only seemed so harmonious because so many voices were not included or didn't sing at all. And there is no way back to that age. Which leads me to the connection between fragmentation and what's been happening with the far right. Basically, what we've seen also virtually across Europe is a process of normalization and mainstreaming. I don't think I need to pontificate or give lectures on one of the mechanisms through which this has happened in Austria. You form an official coalition with the far right. But if even as Machiavellian a politician as Wolfgang Schüssel cannot succeed with a strategy of destruction through inclusion, then you wonder who possibly can. And secondly, and maybe less obviously, plenty of politicians have of course resorted to simply copying the rhetoric of the far right, even while nominally keeping up the so-called cordon sanitaire. I'll just remind you of one incident last year. In February 22, Valérie Pécresse, a Gaullist, as mainstream as it can get in the French Fifth Republic, basically appeared in front of supporters and repeated the theory of the Great Replacement. And then the next day kind of walked it back a little bit. But once you've told nice bourgeois people that this is what's really happening, you can't really take it back the next day. Now, some of you might be tempted to say, but look, this rise of the far right is in and of itself democratic. This is driven by certain grassroots movements. This is due to people wanting different policies. And here, forgive me for being so professorial, here I would simply point you to some literature that basically suggests that this is the wrong way to think about what has been happening recently. Just this year, my former colleague Larry Bartels brought out a book called, tellingly, Democracy Erodes from the Top. And what he shows very convincingly is that in most European countries, there has not, I repeat, there has not been a major shift in public opinion when it comes to questions like what you think about the EU, what you think about refugees, do you trust the main institutions, and so on and so forth. And if we look a little bit further east from here, what he also shows, and this is what people like my colleague Kim Scheppele have been saying for a long time, yes, you can find evidence of so-called illiberal opinions in Hungary and Poland, no doubt. But this is the effect and not the cause of regime change. Of course, if you have by now, more than a dozen years of government propaganda in Hungary, of course people change their minds. And God knows what day and night pro-Putin propaganda right now in Hungary is going to do to the country. But to kind of have this very complacent Western European story that, oh, our brothers and sisters in the East, they were always more illiberal and they didn't have enough time to learn democracy and they hate multiculturalism. There's no evidence for these sorts of claims. Yes, of course, there are differences in political cultures, but these sort of generalizations about, oh, people actually want the far right, simply isn't correct. So long story short, the lesson here is indeed that, yeah, some things do change, but the things that change have much more to do with how elites behave And again, this very sort of convenient liberal story. Oh, it's the people, they're so irrational, they're all waiting to be seduced by the great demagogue. Something that, became very popular. Zalongfähig, again, after 2016, has very little evidence. Now, you might say the lesson isn't really new. Last year, we were commemorating 100 years of the March on Rome. Perhaps we can remind ourselves that, yes, fascists marched on Rome, but Mussolini arrived very comfortably by sleeper car from Milan, because people who in those days would have been called liberal elites had invited him into government and said, you give it a try. We can't really sort of deal with this anymore. Now let's see what works. And they very happily governed with him for a couple of years. So yes, it is time to decide. It is time, for instance, for Christian Democrats in Germany to decide whether they're going to follow this European trend and open themselves up to the far right, something that hasn't happened so far. It's time for German business to decide whether they're going to open themselves up to the far right. Obviously, they've been very comfortable and happy in Hungary with the far right for a long time. Only this year, maybe realizing that if you tolerate the destruction of the rule of law, if you tolerate widespread corruption, sooner or later, it's going to affect you as well. And maybe it's not going to be as great as it seemed for a long time. And yes, it's time for my wealthy Princeton neighbors who work on Wall Street to decide whether yet again they're going to hold their nose and vote for Trump. And yes, it's time for CNN to decide whether they will again platform something that you may as well called triumph of the Trumpist will, which, don't get me wrong, is not to suggest that Trump shouldn't be, on TV or not be interviewed and so on. But the way it was done last week, I think, is again a typical example of what it means to normalize the far right. So that's my. You said hope, right? This was the theme of the panel. Well, there is a little bit of hope, because if it's about elites, I dare say, forgive me again for being so blunt, maybe some of us sometimes have a chance to talk to some of the relevant actors. And if the liberal story about, the masses hate democracy now, were true, it's much less obvious what could really happen. But if it's actually about elite actors that I dare say some people in this room know, then maybe there is something to be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those terrific interventions. I'm going to do something slightly different from the earlier panel, which is I'm going to call on 3 or 4 people before I open the discussion up, just to make brief remarks. And I'd like to start with Kim Scheppele to say, I'm following on from Jan's remarks as to whether once you get that momentum going, whoever is responsible for it, whether you see a sort of cross-fertilization between the far right and populists in Europe and the far right and populists in the United States, and whether they have started to feed off them each other successfully. So Kim, just a relatively short intervention on this.
Yeah, so I want to follow on saying I agree with what Jan said, and maybe a way to put it is that democracy is not dying a natural death, it's being murdered. And it's being murdered by aspirational autocrats who come to power in more or less free and fair elections, almost always taking advantage of some kind of disproportionality in the election scheme that brings them to power, like Trump with the Electoral College in the US or Hungary's disproportionate election system. So it's not that the people, I agree with Jan, it's not that the people are demanding this. So the question is how these folks come to power. And this goes to the beginning of an answer to Misha's question. Orban was elected in 2010 because he had running his campaign 2 Republican Party election consultants from the United States, who also ran his campaign in 2014, and one of them ran his campaign in 2018. So at the beginning of Orban's, shall we say, long run in power, Republican consultants were in there telling him both how to win, how to draft a campaign, and then how to change the election rules so no one could ever win again. A process that is now happening in the United States in full force, which is why I said the US is not really over this yet. There are lots of connections between the Orban folks and the Republican Party in its various incarnations. So you've all seen that Trump endorsed Orban, Orban endorsed Trump. Lots of connections, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, I could go through a whole list of names. But more crucially, what the Republican Party in the United States is doing is admiring what Orban has been able to do in Hungary, which is to come for the culture wars, stay for the autocracy, right? Because essentially the lesson that I think a lot of leaders are learning is that if you engage the public with these kind of emotional culture war issues, they'll put that over voting for Democrats. So to follow on Jan's comment about what some of the academic research is showing, there's some new work that shows that actually the people who vote for aspirational autocrats are not themselves much in favor of autocracy. You ask them questions about whether they believe in, independent courts, free and fair elections, constitutional government, checks and balances. And the countries that score very high on those things are also the countries that are electing autocrats. And how do they do that? It's that the people who are voting put democracy second, and they put something else first, right? So I think this is one of the lessons to be learned. And so the question is, how is this autocracy coming in under the cover of these culture wars? And that is, it sneaks in. And so I just want to say, because this is the news this week in Vienna, some of you saw the headline that a Hungarian institution, a foundation, called the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, just bought this model university here in Vienna, which I gather is the largest private university in the city. The Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest is actually no ordinary foundation. It's the boot camp where Orban trains the young Fidesz leaders. It literally is the center of Orban's propaganda machine. And now it owns the largest university in Vienna. Orban has been buying up the media in Slovenia. He's been buying up the media in North Macedonia, speaking of accession countries. He's had his people fanning out. They are targeting the European elections and trying to build networks of far-right parties with common messages that will cause people to put culture wars first, democracy second. So coming soon to a country near you is Orban. And what will happen is he will lead with messages that will be popular, and then behind the scenes, he will undermine democracy at home.
Thank you very much, Kim. Well, this was a word of warning, but I'm going to exhort the participants today, if they can, to come up with some concrete ideas about how you can counter these challenges, how you can meet the challenges, and whether we have got real mechanisms, ideas out of some of the cul-de-sacs that we appear to find ourselves in now. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn to Anthony Barnett. Anthony, you've looked closely at trends amongst progressive and liberal forces in the UK and the US, and by contrast with many people, I would argue that you're feeling quite optimistic about what you call the definite left. So I'm interested to know what you mean by that and why the optimism.
I don't regard myself as an optimist. I regard myself as not being a pessimist. And I think there's an important difference there. I think the politics across the democracies on a knife edge. And the question that Misha has just dropped on me, which I wasn't preparing to answer, is I wrote an article about the definite left, which drew upon what I thought was a very remarkable experience taking place in the United States, but which points towards a very long-term possible progressive future. And that came from the alliance of the Biden centrists with practical progressives in the American Congress. And I called it definite because an alliance is emerging, which I think is committed to democracy in a way which is not paternalistic, it's not welfarist, it's empowering. And one example that I give of this is that the right to choose on the abortion issue is not a market right, that women should have the right to buy abortions, but it's an empowerment of people that is delivered socially. And secondly, I called it definite with an F because I think that the experience of feminism and Black Lives Matter is transforming the way, especially in the younger generations, people feel both about their identity and about empathy and the way that they feel toward each other. And that this is a very big shift which has taken place. It hasn't come from the socialist traditions. It's connected to the great movement for human rights, which has taken place. And it seemed to me that this was a kind of anti-market countercurrent to the great wave of marketization that we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years. And it's also connected physically to our bodies, to health, to our sense of ourselves, and to how we treat ourselves, and the sense of becoming a species. And the it at the end of definite is because it exists in the United States. There is a practical sense of trying to replace a neoliberal order with a, if possible, a progressive or democratic capitalism. So that's what I was arguing for. But I would just like to add one thing about the danger and the knife edge aspect, picking up on what Jan-Werner was saying, and that is the role of the media. So I'm very struck when Kim talks about Orban buying the media, but in the United States and the United Kingdom, the media got in first, in particular with Rupert Murdoch. And so there is a definite way in which the media loves winner takes all, to the victor the spoils, that kind of polarization, and opens the way to the legitimization of the right. So that democratic, and this is one thing about when we come to practical solutions, democratic solutions are scorned, seen as trivial, marginalized, pilloried in the press. And the far right are given a narrative of they're the real people, all that sort of Trumpite stuff, which I think Jan-Werner is referring to. And so I think that's one of the ways in which our democracy is being undermined, is through the oligarchical control of our media.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And those of us who experienced the referendum in the United Kingdom can only confirm his observations about the media in that country. I think I will go to Janka next, who's been very patiently, she's had her name tag up. Janka.
Thank you so much. I was just prompted by two things that were said in the initial remarks that I found very striking. One of them being, autocracies aren't actually doing so well, which I think if we look at China, demystifying a little bit what's going on, and actually the structural deceleration that we're seeing, the economic troubles that we're seeing, the youth unemployment that we're seeing, telling that story as well, not making it 10 foot tall and unbeatable, but actually saying, this system isn't delivering at the moment, this government is struggling, is an important message also here to everyone who is more in favor of authoritarian tendencies. And the second thing that I found very striking was, Jan, when you said democracy erodes from the top, that the main message that the Chinese leadership has taken from the fall of the Soviet Union is that authoritarianism erodes from the top as well, and you better not let it happen. And so some of these messages that you kind of are posing for democracies really hold true for how authoritarian leaders maintain their power, how they need to stick in power, how you cannot let the elite slip. When Xi Jinping you can quote, he has said more than one time, the reason why the Soviet Union fell was because no one was man enough to defend the system. And I think this is the logic with which we are dealing with, and why our whole question of how we deal with China is one where I always have to giggle a bit when people say we have to unideologically deal with this challenge. This is a highly ideological system, and we have to defend kind of our system as well, because this is a system competition, and it is about democracy just as much, and not just about the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Janka. Gerald.
Yes, I very much agree with what Jan was saying about elites and their responsibilities. And I'm struck by the experience of France, where I've lived for a few years recently. And to see respected writers like Holbeck give interviews where he fantasizes about the coming civil war, where the French will have to go into the mosques and expel the Muslims. And where he then fantasizes about how the white supremacy in America will save Europe. Or where he gave an interview in 2018, not an interview, a speech, which was actually interesting when he got the Oswald Spengler Prize. That already gives you a hint. Where he talks about the decline of the West, and then says, no, it's not a decline, it's suicide. And then he says, no, it's not a suicide, it's a murder. And then he says, because of the EU. And he's been pro-Putin, anti-EU, virulently anti-Muslim, and of course he has pretty clearly supported the Front National. Now, in a country where you then have extremely centralized institutions, where it basically is enough to capture the presidency, very different from Germany, where you have coalitions and checks and federalism, this should really worry us. And these ideas of the Great Replacement in France, Pécresse was already mentioned, which have really become part of the mainstream, are probably the most dangerous ideas in Europe and in America, in the West today. This idea that there is this vast conspiracy and that anybody that you see in the streets who looks different is evidence for this conspiracy. And in the end, the logical conclusion is the only way you can solve this is through expulsions. We've seen so much ethnic cleansing and ethnic violence in Europe in the 20th century, including in recent decades. We know this is deadly serious, but it is very emotional. And that's my second point. Small groups with strong emotions, and the genius of Orban is really, besides his power building and using resources by others to build structures and clientelism, his genius is as a storyteller. You know, if you read his speeches over the last few years, very few people have told this story of the Great Replacement and migration as the existential threat to the West better than Orban. And this is really up to elites. Do we challenge this with arguments and emotions? I think Germany is a good example where it's actually worked. You know, in North Rhine-Westphalia, 18 million people, the AfD is at 6%. It's stronger in the new Länder for a variety of reasons. And I've just been in Saxony, so I won't go into this. But in the areas of Germany which have taken in the most refugees in the last 6 years, which have seen massive regular migration from across the EU, including from Bulgaria and Romania, and migration from the rest of the world, the far right is not that strong yet. And the CDU won elections recently in North Rhine-Westphalia on a very moderate platform. And right now, there is a broad consensus among politicians about the need for more migration. But don't mistake that. They also need a story of control. This is where it's crucial. What frightens people is a loss of control. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, and I end on this, I wouldn't call them liberals, for those who believe in checks and balances and against stories of violence, which is what this Great Replacement theory is. It's a story to justify violence. What we need to do as thinkers, as writers, as intellectuals, as part of this group that has time to think about these issues, is present alternative, not just stories, but strategies of control. And this is where Germany is very interesting at the moment. As opposed to those who say that the only way you can control migration or irregular migration is through violence and force, there is a very intense debate in Germany at the moment which involves all the major parties. Are there ways in which we can allow regular migration, which Germany desperately needs, in exchange for countries cooperating to take back those who arrive irregular, to replace it by resettlement? Can Germany, with a few others in Europe, move towards a Canadian system on migration? And if this succeeds, but we don't have much time, perhaps we can take away one of the big stories of the far right, which is the story that Europe is being overrun, that we have lost control, and that it's all a big conspiracy by liberals, and George Soros is somewhere in the background, and many of us are his henchmen.
Thank you very much, Gerald. I want to mention that for people who are watching on the live stream, if they want to have a look, we are going to get up a QR code here, and with that QR code, it will take you to a Slido website, which will enable you, from the comfort of your sofas, to pose questions to our panel, and they should, if the iPad here reconnects to the internet, they should be able to ask those questions to our panel via me once we get to the Q&A. This story of narrative, of course, is incredibly important, very important in the United States, where you're seeing the end at the moment of the Reagan narrative, which has lasted over many presidencies. And I think you could argue that the Republicans in the United States are in a rather desperate state at the moment, and they're throwing everything that they can at the electoral system, at the Constitution of the United States, because they're in a state of panic, that they are retreating. And Biden is turning out to be a surprisingly transformative president who may well shift the narrative, and I think the Inflation Reduction Act may be part of that. But Ivan, what about you? I was hoping you were going to give us some sort of long-term trends that will challenge the idea of how robust or fragile democracies in Europe are. But of course, you can talk about whatever you like.
Thank you very much. But I want to start with something that Katarzyna said. She said, we democracies are not doing very well, but authoritarians are not doing very well too. And by the way, this is not new. In the 1970s, famous French political scientist Pierre Asner came with the term competitive decadence. The problem is not who is going to do better, the problem is who is going to do worse. The difference is, and for me this is because this was a really very important presentation on both sides, because the problem is how we are framing where is the problem with democracy. Listen, we can say, right, and I do believe Jan is right, you cannot blame the people, but the moment when you blame the elites, what you're doing is you still insist that the major divide in society is between people and elites. And you're reproducing the major scheme. And here's the story. I talked to a very senior Republican after Trump was elected, and I said, listen, are you going to handle him? He said, 20 years ago, we were going to handle him for 2 months because we have been coherent elite. We were coming from the same families, from the same schools, we were totally privileged, we have a very high trust between each other. But the problem is that the Republican Party also was democratized. Suddenly, different type of money, different type of people entered, and these traditional elites cannot handle somebody whom they don't like. Trump is kind of a quite crazy even for some of his voters, at least donors. Why I'm saying this? Because we're coming in a moment where I see the real problem that both on the left and on the right, there is a consensus that the system is broken. And from this point of view, the problem of the elites, in my view, is going to try to come a different offer what it means basically to reform the system, then basically to try to insist, no, it's okay. It works. And being the broken system, and this is my last point, coming from something that really worries me is, I don't believe that democracy can work in two cases. One is when the stakes are very low. Imagine, and by the way, in Eastern Europe it has happened in the 1990s, you're voting differently on every elections and you're getting the same policies. It was important, we're calling this consensus, but when basically the politics goes to consensual, people decided to vote in a wild way to try to basically show how unhappy they are. But then democracy cannot also function when the polarization is so big that you believe that if the major threat to democracy is the other party, you win the elections. And I do believe this is the real story, and this is what we're seeing in places basically like the United States or Turkey or Poland. Everybody is for democracy. The only real problem with democracy is the other party to win. So you're ready to tolerate undemocratic behavior of your own people if they're going to guarantee you that you're going to win. And in my view, this is the story which I found really kind of a very difficult, because for the European Union, the major story is that, and when you say long trends, I don't believe that the problem of Europe is the lack of democracy on European level. I never believed this. The problem is that people have, that nevertheless that they have more rights, they don't have more power. And this sense of powerlessness because the world has become more complex, insecure, you don't know exactly what you're doing, creates a situation in which you're ready to trust a person. You're not ready to trust in institutions. And while Kim is totally right that people like Orban are engineering the system and making almost impossible for the opposition to win, keep in mind, this is what they promised. There is a term in Poland called legal impossibilism, where Mr. Kaczynski said, either you're going to give me the whole power, or I cannot deliver to you what I have promised because of central banks, because of courts. So we're in a very critical moment. And while I agree very much that the far right is one of the major stories that we are facing, the other problem is that the idea that the system does not work is a new consensus. It is not simply in one of the corners of the political spectrum. Many of the climate activists are going to agree that for them the democracy does not work. So probably we should try to find a way how to change it than simply to defend it.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm going to go to Milica next. I'll come to you in a minute, Soli, after Taras, because I want you and Katarzyna to speak together. But Milica, you go next.
Thank you. I think somebody, I can't remember who, made a remark earlier that was a decent year for democracy. And given that since the war in Ukraine started, we had 2 autocrats re-elected in Hungary and recently in Turkey, I'm not sure that we can describe it that way. The second point would be, if you have a war between an undemocratic country and a democratic country, is everybody supporting a democratic country necessarily a democrat? Or you need to have a wider front of countries supporting, in this case, Ukraine? I think, to paraphrase even with regard to the Congress or what was it, Conference of Democracies, either you end up being hypocritical and probably more than it's tolerable in a liberal society, or you end up having too narrow a front where you exclude potential allies which you might need to succeed. And the third point, which I would take from these, is how can we avoid having this debate being a one-dimensional one, because this debate sits not only time-wise in between 2 important debates. One is geopolitical, where you need to have more allies and where we discussed enlargement and everything, and the other is green transition. You might end up needing to engage different countries, not democratic countries, and to build coalition for different things. How do you actually engage with them? And there, to go back to what Misha asked us to do, what would be the proposal? My proposal would be try to do no harm and not to use this discourse openly legitimizing things that shouldn't be legitimized. Be more targeted and structure interventions. Some are going to be transactional, but if you invoke values and normative language, then you need to invoke it in a way that is credible.
Thank you, Milica. I'm going to ask Taras, and then Soli and Katarzyna get ready on Turkey and Poland.
Right, I want to go back to this opposition between elites and masses, and something that also Kim has mentioned about the Republican consultants. So, of course, Orban in Hungary has been in the business of constructing a kind of not just an autocracy, but an oligarchic autocracy, with trying to construct in the place taken up by foreign capital a coalition of national industrialists, national capitalists. So in a sense, the main beneficiary of his project, besides Orban and Fidesz, was a man called Mészáros, right? But this is not just a story about the narrowest of the elites. It's a story about broad factions of the middle class that has benefited vastly from this process of economic redistribution that Orban's government has started. And you mentioned Republican consultants. We can talk about journalists, we can talk about accountants and lawyers, not just those who maintain transnational infrastructures that allow Mészáros's money to be parked elsewhere, but Hungarian ones, right? And of course, before, so I'm trying to say that there are broad space of not elites, but upper middle classes and middle classes, people very much like us, who have benefited from that autocratic regime. So we need to ask, what are the mechanisms that keep them benefiting? And of course, before these Republican consultants went to Hungary, they'd been to Ukraine. Before they'd been to Ukraine, they'd been to Azerbaijan, often the very same people. Yanukovych got elected in 2010 thanks to the help of a US political consultant who'd been moonlighting to the tune of 70 million euros in between US electoral cycles. And I think professions, and I've studied that on the example of journalists in Ukraine, professions have a very big role to play because these systems of power, they're not just maintained by political parties and their mass support and so on, they are also maintained by technocratic experts who think they're outside of politics and who maintain the sort of infrastructure that keeps these political processes happening and going. And we need to think about a democratic way of potentially regulating them in a way that would prevent them from supporting these sort of autocratic transformations.
Taras, thank you very much. And so, talking about autocratic transformations, Soli, what do you make of Sunday's election?
Okay. If you'd allow me, I also would like to say something about the debate so far.
Please.
Then I'll get to Turkey. Jan, in the previous round, said that we should not put the liberal elites at the center of everything, that we should look at the strategies of those who actually challenge them. So I'll take issue with what Ivan has said. When you look at the Republican Party, there is a systematic effort from 1979 onwards to actually take over the party by delegitimizing American democracy's institutions, and the leader of that was, of course, none other than Newt Gingrich. So Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker have come up with this term, plutocratic populism, and if somehow the Republicans managed to serve plutocratic interests while mobilizing popular resentments, if you will, for populist policies, particularly in the post-Cold War period. That was much more fertile ground for them. That's one. Second, I mean, obviously, zillions of books are published every year, but I mean, already in 1983, probably earlier in the French version, Jean-François Revel, who was a journalist, wrote this book called How Democracies Perish. And the problem, and this was the second Cold War and stuff, and the idea was, how do we actually defend democracies? Because they are constantly challenged from within, and if you're going to allow people to participate, can you really block them because you don't like what they're saying? And this is really the core of Jan's book, that is, are these really democratic movements that we should tolerate, or are they a threat? And they are a threat because they're not pluralist, they don't really believe in democracy and all that. And this is a quandary. I don't know what one can do about that. Finally, I think it is important to look at the relation between democracy and capitalism. I mean, Jan says, okay, my neighbors at Princeton, what will they decide how they're going to do, what they're going to do? And if it is indeed an elite decision to go one way or another, then we really have to look at the crisis of capitalism alongside the crisis of democracy. And I don't know which way it works in different countries, but that is, in my judgment, the single most important thing, because contrary to what we were led to believe, liberalism and democracy on the one hand, and liberal democracy and capitalism on the other, are not necessarily natural allies. Finally, Joe Biden put trillions of dollars in the pockets of Americans. The unemployment rate is at its lowest, 3.4 or 3.2. He is trying to, whether we like his policies, he's trying to reindustrialize the damn country, and thus have a much more socially conscious approach to those things, and his popularity is at 38%. Please explain. How is he going to be a transformative figure? We are afraid of a Trump comeback in 2024. and it is not objectively explicable as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, in our case, now news are coming to me that there's been a lot of cheating, especially in smaller neighborhoods or in smaller constituencies in the country. But Erdogan did have control over 90% of the media. He did have total control of the state apparatus, which he used, obviously, to cheat. But it is also true that this election was, as far as I'm concerned, was about what kind of country Turkey was, and the country is divided. Nationalism is on the rise, but part of that nationalism is more religious and conservative nationalism, and part of it is very secular nationalism. And where do we put the secular nationalists? On the part of the modernizers who want to continue with the original Republican project, or do we put them in a different category? So the second round is going to be pretty important, and there too, the issue of agency becomes important, because when we look back, although the campaign was not bad, the opposition candidate could have been different. The way they have reacted to things that happened Sunday night could have been different. We will go to a second round. I personally do not have much hope that the second round may give us a different result. But increasingly, I'm thinking maybe it is not totally impossible for the second round to give us a different result, because maybe some people who were complacent, who did not go to the polls, although the participation rate was at 85%, may decide that it is worth giving it another try if this demoralization is overcome in due time. So, and finally, coming back to the elites and closing, there is no way the economic elites in the country, no matter what their ideology is, could be happy with the so-called unorthodox policies that Erdogan is actually implementing. But the fear factor, the pressure, the fact that it is a patronage network-based economic management probably also keeps them from joining the ranks of the opposition and help the other camp.
Thank you, Soli. I just think I'd throw in, to enhance what you were saying, one book that is worth reading is Jane Mayer's Dark Money, in terms of the systematic attempt over a 30-year period of the Republican Party to shift the narrative in the United States. Katarzyna, are you happy to give us an assessment of the forthcoming Polish elections and what that might mean?
So if I may, commenting situation in Poland, at the same time refer to some elements of our discussions. I definitely agree with the statement that the democracy erodes from the top. But the thing is that it started to erode a long time before the populists came to power. And that means that something went wrong with the so-called, or in fact, liberal governments. And what happened in Poland, that after 25 years of different but definitely pro-European, pro-democratic and liberal governments, it was almost impossible for these governments and for Polish liberal elites to admit that something went wrong. So, in fact, they didn't. What they did, they just blamed the people. That's why I mean, it's very difficult to me to agree with this perception that it's been the liberal elites who killed democracy, and so just people don't want the dismantling of democracy. Yes, obviously people don't want dismantling of democracy, but people want something, and to blame them for their wrong choice, this is not the best democratic strategy. And that was the reason, and the Polish opposition was just waiting for the people to realize that they voted wrong, and next time they should vote for the liberal elites. But it didn't happen. And in fact, the democratic, so-called democratic elite lost 4 elections in a row, including the local elections, European elections, and 2 parliamentary elections, and 2 presidential elections. So it's quite a lot. So what was the conclusion of the mainstream of liberal elite? If people are stupid and they are still voting for this bad option, we should do what this bad option does. So we should behave like the liberal elites. And what we have now in Poland is the competition between the ruling party and the major opposition party, who is the bigger populist, who offer people more. The ruling party, the leader of the ruling party just offered the incredible benefits, given that we have quite high inflation now in Poland, benefits, social benefits to people. And the response of the leader of the biggest opposition party was to offer even more, and not after the elections, but now. Why not? So this is the debate we have now in Poland. And my impression is that this cannot work because the liberal elites will never be better in being populist than the real populism. So, and here that brings me back to this very important dilemma of fragmentation and polarization. Yes, in some countries, perhaps fragmentation may bring some instability to democratic process, but in some countries, and Poland is definitely one of them, polarization, so this two-party system, or de facto two-party system, may be one of the main killers of democracy. So that is my personal assessment, that the outcome of these elections will depend on ability of smaller players to depolarize the political scene in Poland. Because if we have 2 camps, then the, let's call them a populist camp, wins. And it's been, I mean, it has happened like 6 times, and definitely the last presidential elections, we had the best possible candidate, I mean, from the perspective of liberal elite, and he lost. So the more of the same will bring the more of the same. And then there is one more tricky issue here, because there are like 2 parties which try to depolarize the system. One is even more radical than the ruling party, and the other one is more democratic. And the question is, which one will succeed, whether depolarization is possible in Poland, and if it is, whether far-right party or the center party will benefit from this polarization, and that this process will determine the outcome of the election. So this is not, as you see, just a simple forecast, but quite complicated process.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. But these are complicated issues, and so you shouldn't be worried about that at all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Kirsten Dunlop to intervene, and then I'm going to throw it onto the floor, and then at the end I'll ask Jan if he wants to make some final remarks. Katarzyna, if you have any other final remarks after that, you can as well, but you may feel as though you've said what you wanted to say, so the choice will be yours. Kirsten.
Thank you. I want to bring a perspective from as a refugee. I am an Australian passport holder who's a refugee in Europe because of actually what I would consider to be an absolute demonstration of democracy eroding from the top. And it's a perspective around that's linking a couple of things. I particularly wish to pick up on your point, Soli, about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And bring into that, for example, the latest report from the Club of Rome, Earth for All, which is pointing out that there are no generations or very few generations that have lived a healthy democracy, a democracy that has not been captured by a set of professionalized, and I would very much agree with you, Tara, on the question of the professions and the role that they are playing, on professional power broking, serving a set of interests linked strongly to extractive neoliberal economics and economic thinking. And if you then look at, okay, so when does this start to happen, you can see a whole chunk of time where there are decades upon decades of what I would describe as the infantilization of any form of effective democratic system in order to ensure that it is easier to capture with a set of interests. And those interests are obviously very lively at play in terms of what we're dealing with now. How do you unwind an existing set of capital market economics and a set of assumptions that are serving a deeply, deeply widening inequality? I think there is something in that we really need to pay attention to. And the reason why I referred to being Australian, one of the things that I challenge myself on constantly when I look at the disaster of what has been previous, a series of decades, lost decades of action, of enormous wealth generated and lost, has been that very few people actively elect to go into politics, other than those who go into politics for the purpose of wielding power. And that is a shift. That is a genuine, that's a shift in education, in expectation, in mindset, in what people believe is an aspirational career. What is politics for? Why would you choose it? And it's fascinating now to watch the shift in Australian context, for example, of what I call the teal, who are all independent, actually, interestingly, predominantly women, but independent candidates standing up to say, this is a system of effects that I don't wish to participate in these terms. It's not a professional power broking. There's something about standing up for a set of social interests. So that notion of an infantilized state in kind of entangled with a set of economic, and I don't think not originally intentional, but a set of unintended consequences of economic systems and of the globalization of economic systems is one of the things I would really want us to pay attention to. And then in that context, yes, humans change because of story. If we don't understand that, then we fail to understand how to change ourselves. Who is the most powerful storyteller? Is the person, the collective that moves hearts and minds. The storytelling immensely matters. And that same degree of a professionalization of investment in the storytelling is something to ask ourselves. Have we professionalized the investment in the stories that would enable youth movements not to be movements of anger and resentment and despair, but maker movements, forming new forms of democracy and new forms of leadership because they have a sense of the narratives that empower and enable that?
Well, on that very clear message, I'm going to throw it open to the audience. As I say, I can't take messages from the live streaming because it appears that the internet on this device in the age of ChatGPT has gone down. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to restrict myself to the audience. I see somebody at the front there. I can't see anything, I warn you, so Oh, Ivana, it's you. You're not allowed to ask a question. Anyone apart from the other moderator wants to ask a question? There's one over there. I've got one there. Yeah, that gentleman who's standing up, I think it's a gentleman these days.
Yes, gentleman. Former diplomat, now a democracy activist, but I'm asking maybe a provocative question because thinking back over the last 25 years, I think if you talk about distrust in the democratic system, one of the problems is that voters have voted, but the biggest changes came not from democratic elections, they came from outside external factors. And I think this is a big issue, and it has also something to do with this relationship between capitalism and liberal democracy. 2008, the banking crisis, beforehand, not a lot of public money could be used, as we were told, because austerity, etc. Afterwards, the banks were saved. And that was not a problem, and the billions and billions that were thrown at it were not a problem. For good or bad, but still, I think the experience was, if we had asked for this before, we would have been told by the system it's not possible to mobilize these resources. Same thing about the pandemics. Same thing, I think, also about the refugee crisis, where this got a very, very negative narrative, as we heard. And I think we are in a similar situation now with the climate crisis, where people also realize that 25 years nothing has happened. Simply nothing has happened. This is what my daughter tells me, and it's very difficult to tell her that this is not a true story. So we need to talk about the boundaries of the system that obviously, have restricted voter freedom, I think, or at least the expression of changes that everyone or many people saw as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I think, as much a comment as a question, but valuable nonetheless. And it is striking that nobody on the panel has yet mentioned 2008 and the financial crash. This gentleman over here.
Hello, Clemens Dreyen from Erste Group. I have a question. One of the themes that has not been mentioned so far is technology and democracy. I think it's really interesting that actually it was not mentioned, yeah? But in itself, there was a very unsavory connection of technology in the Trump election, for example. So technology can be a threat, a clear threat to democracy, but also it could be a tool to safeguard democracy. Do you have thoughts on that?
Very good question. I see a hand at the back there. That's all I can see is a hand. So I have no idea to whom it belongs.
Hi, it's Neil Aaron. I'm the editor at the Fellowship for Journalistic Excellence. I'm just intrigued about one of the stories that we're told repeatedly in Britain about how Brexit happened, which is that it was a combination of deindustrialization, mass migration, both of which are kind of symptoms of globalization, but at the same time there was left-wing constituencies that effectively turned to the right because the left had given up on its old message of economic redistribution. And that story is also told about, Trump voters in kind of Pittsburgh or whatever. You had the story from France of former kind of hardcore communist communities that then switched to the National Front. And I was just wondering, really, from the panel, I felt some panelists kind of touched on this question, but whether they felt that the left's abandonment of its old kind of economic focus in favor of kind of more cultural issues was at all part of the rise of populism. In the way that the right had then been able to kind of appeal to those communities with a cultural message, even if it wasn't really acting in their economic interests.
Great, thank you. So, two very good questions and one robust comment, food for thought. Kim, you've got your thing up, and then Taras, if you can address the comments from the floor.
Yeah, so I think my thoughts go to questions 1 and 3, which is that I think you're absolutely right to say that one of the things that deepening economic integration, including in the EU, what that's done is it's taken out of the hands of national politics the ability to do very much about economic issues of the old-fashioned redistributive sort. So as inequality is magnified, the ability of individual countries to really redistribute has been sharply limited by their entrenchment, in this kind of broader economic system. And that's why it's so interesting in a government like Poland, which has been handing out these sort of family subsidies, or ditto in Hungary, where again, it's been kind of middle-class, benefits, lower taxes, and benefits for children, and so on. But this is sort of bucking against the trend. So if it's the case that one of the things economic integration has brought us is the inability of national governments to do much about it, then the system on which our party system has been based for 150 years, namely a kind of left to right dimension, starts to disappear, right? Because if the left was in favor of redistribution and the right was in favor of deregulation or something like that, the answer is most countries don't have a big choice. So what's happened, I think, is that politics has shifted to issues that national governments can do something about, which is where you get these culture war issues, whereas where you get this migration is still a national competence in the EU, for example. So this is where politics moves, and that has a couple of consequences. One is that those are issues about which it's much harder to compromise, With redistribution, with regulation, there's a more or less space within which you can negotiate answers. With a lot of the identity questions and with migration issues, it's much harder to do more or less, sort of solutions to culture war issues. So what this has done is to take parties of the left, which no longer campaign as readily on redistribution, and parties of the right, which don't necessarily campaign on issues of deregulation, and what you find are parties that mix these things up, So you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's on the right, which used to be the deregulatory part of the spectrum. And in fact, Orban himself, started as a kind of Hayekian liberal. Now Orban's been nationalizing big chunks of the economy. And now is that a left or a right policy? Which side is he on? And you start seeing this kind of mix-up of left and right. And what that's done is it's kind of messed up the traditional party system. So you see battles, and this is, I think, a lot of Brexit. Anthony and I were talking about this earlier. Brexit turns out to be a battle within the Tory party between nationalist and cosmopolitan camps. This has also happened in the US Republican Party. You see it on the left in the US in the battle between the sort of Clinton wing and the Sanders wing, of the party which Biden has somehow been able to straddle. And so this is what's tearing up the traditional parties, leading to what Jan talked about, which is this decline of traditional parties, the rise of upstart parties, and some of those parties are headed by autocrats, right? So I do think it is connected to the fact that economic integration has limited the room for maneuver of national governments, and yet we still have national parties that have to differentiate themselves on something that national governments can still affect.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm going to go to Guntram next because he hasn't spoken on this panel. I'm very interested to hear his thoughts.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to make two remarks. The first is the statement that economic integration fundamentally prevents us from redistribution, I think is an overstatement. And if anything, Brexit has shown us the opposite, right? I mean, Brexit has meant far less integration with the European Union, far less trade, but has it improved in any way distributional outcomes in the UK? Not at all. On the contrary, resources available for national health services, for many, many issues have actually gone down. So I think we need to be really, really careful with the statement that economic integration prevents, as a general rule, redistribution. There are some aspects of economic integration, especially, of course, tax competition for corporates, that is an issue. But I think these are concrete issues that can be addressed and can be solved. It's more a question of political will rather than actual the fact of economic integration. Now that's the first point. The second point, and I thought the question on technology was really a great question, because if anything, I mean, that's the area where I'm most worried about democracy. I mean, we are entering a phase where it will become very, very difficult to distinguish who actually made a speech, who actually wrote a text. Was it a machine? Was it a bot? Was it a Russian bot? Was it a Chinese bot? Whatever. We have already passed the period where it's basically just amplification through platform economy. Now we are really entering the phase where actually everybody can generate whatever messages, fake news, deep fakes, etc. And I think we are not prepared for this at all. And I think that's, for me, the biggest worry for democracy that I would certainly put forward. Thank you.
Yeah, very good point indeed. I would say, having done some work on artificial intelligence over the past few months, this is extremely unpredictable where it's going to lead us. What I'm going to do is just ask if there's any final question from the audience. Taras, I will let you come back. But if there is, a final question there. I might even squeeze a second one in, but I want Jan then to finish up. Oh, it's Hedvig. She's not a moderator, so she's allowed to ask a question.
Thank you. Hedwig Morway from the Erste Foundation. You mentioned, Ms. Scheppele, Orban's boot camp for building the next generation of conservatives and the liberals, his followers. So I wonder, where is the boot camp, the democracy boot camp for the new generation of democrats in Europe?
Good, pithy question. And just down here, a final question. I think, again, I can't see, but it's, yes.
Thank you very much, Irene Giener. It's actually very much along the same lines that Hedwig raised the issue, how to mobilize youth who is so disaffected from the current political system. Any ideas, because this falls very much under the heading of hope, and also how to bring in marginalized groups. There are many marginalized groups in our societies, and the issue of the empowerment of women, while they are obviously a majority in our societies, is still an issue that is relevant for democracy, in my view, as well.
Okay, fine. As a final answer to those two questions, the boot camp question and the one we just heard, I'm going to ask Anthony to say something before giving the floor to Katarzyna if she wants it, but and then we'll be winding up. Anthony.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. On this point of the possible boot camps, I do want to make, when we began, Misha talked about the tyranny of referendums, but I think the importance of referendums, and this relates to the question, a very important question of people feeling in control, is how they are conducted and the process by which they are conducted. So I think that if you look at Switzerland, you know, referendums can be built into a constitutional system in a way which is genuinely representative and deliberative. And one of the answers to the question of can there be a democratic boot camp and can you integrate marginal groups is through the issue of citizens' assemblies. So if you take the example of the two Irish referendums, one on gay marriage and one on abortion, the political parties were incapable of resolving them, but there was, because of the coalition, there were citizens' assemblies drawn at random, but with a representative cross-section of the population which deliberated on the issues and proposed the question that should be put and supported a kind of answer, and that the referendums which then followed, which were transformative and profoundly democratic, were seen as legitimate. They weren't manipulative. They didn't come from a minority. They weren't sort of, so to speak, they didn't pass through the distortion of an oligarch media. And I think it's important that a lot of, especially of the younger generation, feel the system doesn't work. They feel that representative democracy is overpolarized, but they are capable of collective wisdom, and that this is one of the elements which should be built into our democratic processes if we are going to resolve the situation of the big transformation that is taking place. And this is especially important with climate change and climate change policies, and how you legitimate quite radical measures which are going to be needed, which people, if they feel that the representative system is stolen from them, they're not going to accept. But if they feel that the process of decision-making has been deliberative and inclusive, they're much more willing to accept.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm very glad that somebody brought up practical, concrete solutions about how you go ahead, and deliberative democracy is something which has raised its head only for the first time. A very quick two-fingered intervention from Kim before I hand over to Jan.
Right. So on democracy boot camps, this is something that there were lots of in the 90s. When people thought that the states coming out from under communism needed guidance. The problem is that this is everywhere in Europe now. This is not an East-West issue alone. And it seems to me that this is one of the things that the EU, that the Council of Europe, that good member states that want to do this could rise to the occasion and actually think about how it is we educate youth, so to speak. Instead, what we're seeing are textbook censorship. We're seeing the closing in of university curricula, We're seeing, universities under attack, as you probably know. Almost all the universities in Hungary were recently privatized under politicized boards of trustees, and now Florida is following Hungary. So we need to defend academic freedom. We need to defend boot camps, and all these institutions are under attack. And if I can just abuse just 1 second on just the limits of redistribution, read the European semester reports. The reason why Macron had to do pension reform now was that the EU was pressing him to do it, and when the National Front is there, National Rally is there, nipping at his heels, is this the right time to really do that? The EU is tone deaf on when it pushes different kinds of structural reforms on member states.
Thank you very much. Jan.
So if I may, one word about technology, and then a story in response to Misha's initial question, wo bleibt das Positive, what can we do concretely? So I think, again, it's interesting in retrospect that there's been something perversely comforting for some people about a certain kind of technological determinism, which basically says, oh, every media revolution is going to give us some horrible form of politics, printing press, religious civil wars, radio Hitler, TV McCarthy, and social media triumph of right-wing populism and so on. And in retrospect, these stories are not totally wrong, but every single time we should have learned the lesson that no, there are still political decisions to be made, and there's still questions about regulation. And this isn't 2016 anymore. In 2016, everybody was saying, oh, silos, filter bubbles, echo chambers. As some researchers have now said, well, look, there was something perverse about a certain kind of echo chamber about echo chambers. We told each other the story the whole time. There's no empirical evidence that this is really the main problem. And what there is evidence for is that every new media infrastructure is built on top of an existing one. So if you want to talk about pathologies in the United States, how the hell can people believe that in DC there's a pizzeria and downstairs, etc.? You have to ask not about technology as such, but about the rise of cable, radio, regulatory decisions that were made in the 80s and that had long-term effects, which is not to minimize some of the dangers of social media, which some of you have also pointed out, but the sort of fatalistic, oh, everything is going to end badly because look at the US, this and that in terms of the worst kind of excesses, that is far too simplistic. And by now we know plenty of good answers, be it breakup of monopoly platforms, be it subsidies for local journalism, with which everything still starts in terms of connecting people's daily lives to get good information, getting engaged in politics, and so on. Okay, the story about what can be done. So this might sound very counterintuitive, but the very thing that is so often suspected of being inherently populist might sometimes be a good response. What am I talking about? A referendum. Why? For two reasons. First of all, and this is alluded to by a number of speakers, a lot of these far-right actors know that their policies and their ideas are actually not popular. Right now, plenty of Republican state legislatures are raising the level that is needed for popular referenda on abortion, among other things. Of course, Orban does these fake national consultations about certain kinds of issues. But remember when Hungarian citizens wanted to have referenda about Olympics in Budapest, for instance, was nipped in the bud. These people don't like to be shown that they actually don't really speak for all the people and that their ideas are super popular. Now, secondly, maybe less obviously, and I'm sort of reluctant to say this in Soli's presence, but my impression is that in a number of countries, if you have these large coalitions of opposition parties going up against Orban, Erdogan, etc., people might sometimes legitimately ask, okay, but what am I getting by way of policy in the end? Am I going to get Jobbik, or am I going to get some left-wing, party? Who's really going to be in charge? I'm not saying that therefore, all these outcomes are justified, but if you do a referendum with a binary question, you get around this problem. It's a yes-no, and you don't have to have, complicated policy questions at the core. So hence, under certain conditions, that might be a good thing. And last thing, if I may, in response to Anthony, so I agree with the importance of citizen assemblies. At the same time, we should not oversell this as a kind of panacea and solution. And again, it's interesting to note that maybe one of the reasons why the Irish thing is now always held up as something so successful is that it was actually connected to referenda. In the French Convention on Climate, one of the interesting outcomes, not always noted, was that the people who were randomly selected didn't want a referendum.
Why not? Because they said, we have now become experts, but we don't trust our fellow citizens. We think they're going to make the wrong choice. We've now understood how dangerous everything is, but we're worried that if we open it up to the people, and instead they left it to Macron. And you all know what Macron did in response. And in retrospect, it seems, had it been a referendum, it would have won. And people would have been ready to do something more radical on climate, and they were afraid of giving it to the people. So in a strange way, even though it was randomly selected citizens, a certain kind of elitism crept into that institution. I'm sorry, that was not a very positive note at the end, but you know,
No, it was very, very helpful. Now, before we give our panelists a rousing round of applause, I'm going to ask Katarzyna if she has anything she wants to say at the end.
Just very short remark, what can be done or what has to be done, I mean, to end on a positive note. And definitely I agree with all the suggestions regarding the deliberative democracy. We need it in a referendum that is especially on identity issues. But at the same time, we need a decisive democracy, because this is what people expect. And if the populists are the only one who offer the decisive policy, then people just vote for them. So the question is how to make democracy, on the one hand, more deliberative, but on the other hand, not to forget about this decisiveness. And here I think we've had a very interesting experience with firstly COVID and then the war, because so many things which were totally impossible then suddenly were possible, because there was a pressure of health emergency, and then of course the very serious security threat, and then the problem of influx of Ukrainian refugees was suddenly and very effectively, I must admit, solved by this scheme which was there in the acquis communautaire, but somehow, I don't know, no one remembered about it. And then when there was a need, it was found and it was applied and it worked. The same with oil, gas dependency on Russian energy resources, which are at the same time fossil fuels, so it has something to do with the climate issue. So there was total, no to any changes in this sphere, and then suddenly it was possible, it happened, and very effectively over just 1 year, we almost totally cut off Europe from the Russian supplies. So my recommendation would be to think about that the first thought should be not that this is not possible, but perhaps look for the ways to make things possible, and not only under the pressure like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but just in the normal politics, because the solutions, they are sometimes on the table, we are just not looking for them.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. So, we're only 4 minutes over time, which in the world of conference timing is a big victory. So you can include me in the robust round of applause that you're going to give to all our panel. Thank you. And back at 6 o'clock on the dot for the final panel on energy, which will be very interesting.